So here is our plan for tonight. We look forward that Father Jarosław Duraj, who also celebrates the publication of his PhD, we are very happy also to celebrate that tonight, on Eric Voegelin, so will honor this, I think, not so well-known tradition of Father Yves Raguin as contemplation as an opportunity for interreligious dialogue. Then I will just also wrap up the key topics by explaining the link, what we also wondering, what is the link between contemplation and leadership, and why this has such a big importance. We already do this activity since 1 year, and we want to continue it until the whole Ignatian year, running from May 2021 until next year, July 2022. And then, as always, we conclude with question and answers. So, again, thank you for coming here. I also want to remind you that it's here a wonderful place we use in cooperation with the Newman Center, which has been opened only last December, and where we also have these contemplation sessions. So without further ado, I would now give the floor to Father Jarosław Duraj.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, and it is my really deep joy and gratitude for your presence here. Your presence gives meaning to this forum. As we are going to discuss the contribution of Father Yves Raguin, not only to the question of, to the topic of contemplation, but broadly to interreligious dialogue, although our focus is contemplation, since we have been proposing this contemplation courses for some time, Father Rothlin in Hong Kong, but now in Macau as well. So let me introduce briefly the context, and then I will go to the gist of the matter in order to use efficiently our time. You see exceptionally 3 Jesuits here, and 3 of them with ties, which is quite unusual. This coincidence, we did not choose that intentionally. Well, 2 Jesuits are going to talk about another Jesuit, so I hope we will be not too self-referential, against which Pope Francis is warning often, right? Not to be too self-referential. So I will try to be objective and to share with you what I see the most important dimension, which has been to some degree forgotten or not fully developed, undertaken even by our other Ricci institutes. Altogether there are 4 Ricci institutes in the world, in Paris, in Taipei, in San Francisco, and in Macau. Here we have Father Luis Sequeira, who is one of the founding members of Macau Ricci Institute. Father Yves Raguin was one of the founding members of the Taipei Ricci Institute. So briefly about the context, because this is also important. I think Father Rothlin already mentioned about that. So my presentation will be divided into these sections. I hope to finish all these aspects within the time framework. First, I will talk briefly about the context, then about Yves Raguin, then the relationship between contemplation, transformation, and conversion, and finally about leadership, mission, and dialogue. So we are going to celebrate the Ignatian year from May 20th, very soon, with opening Mass, and then it will last until July 31st, 22, until next year. This is the Ignatian year for the whole society, but also for our lay collaborators, very important moment. all over the world. So here in Macau, we also have prepared several activities, 4 major activities, plus opening and closing mass. So all of this Father Superior in a due time will be informing you, so I don't enter into the details. This year will be, what is the Ignatian year? It's the anniversary of 500 years anniversary of conversion of Saint Ignatius. When Ignatius, the soldier, was injured by a cannonball in the Battle of Pamplona. The year will conclude on July 31st, 22, which is the feast day of Saint Ignatius. The peak of the celebration will fall on March 12th, 22 next year, which will mark the 400th years anniversary of the canonization of Saint Ignatius as Saint Francis Xavier. So, what is that conversion and transformation in the life of Ignatius about? This is very important in order to understand the context. The battle of Pamplona in 1521, when he was a soldier, he was deeply wounded, and because of this wound, he was taken to Loyola and could not continue as a soldier. So he had to revise his life. He experienced a deep transformation, spiritual transformation and reorientation from a life as a soldier to become a soldier of Christ. So during this convalescence, this recovery, he was reading spiritual writings, and this way started to rethink and reevaluate his life. The outcome and the result of this transformation, he expressed in the small booklet called Spiritual Exercises, which became a source and inspiration for generation of Jesuits and lay people through all these 500 years, inspiring and converting, helping in transforming the lives of so many people. One of these, nowadays, there are also some Jesuits who were deeply transformed and inspired by these spiritual exercises, and from them, in a sense, I would like to start our reflection. So one of them is Franz Jalic, who was in the time of Pope Francis Bergoglio, Cardinal Bergoglio, Pope Francis today. When he was the provincial, Franz Jalic was imprisoned by a military junta in Argentina and suffered terribly, and then managed to escape and went to Germany and founded the retreat house, guiding, offering retreats, especially contemplative exercises through all these years. And as you see, he just passed away recently in February 13th. A wonderful person, and I had a privilege, I think Father Rothlin also, to meet him and to really experience the exercises under his guidance. The second person, which was also instrumental in my life, probably the deepest impact in my life, was given by Father Kakichi Kadowaki, a Japanese Jesuit who was also a Zen master. He also passed away a few years ago, 2017, and in my view, he did a wonderful job of integration of spiritual exercises, or Christian spirituality, if you like, with Zen practice. Amazing work, and if you are interested, you may go to the works of this previous Franz Jalic also. Certain books were published, also one translated, as far as I know, into Chinese. And Kakichi Kadowaki, for example, the Zen and the Bible, very famous book and very precious source of reflection. So the third person about which I would like to talk today is Father Yves Raguin, Gan Yifeng Shenfu, Chinese name. He was born on November 9, 1912 and died on December 9, 1998 in Taipei, Taiwan. Few things about his life. I would have a lot to say about his personal experiences, but we don't have time. Let me briefly state that he was a sinologist, Buddhologist, theologian, and the founder of the Ricci Institute in Taipei, and he contributed to the research on Chinese spiritual traditions as developed in Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. As a scholar, priest, and missionary, and spiritual master as well, he contributed greatly to the promotion of dialogue between Christianity and Asian wisdom traditions such as Buddhist Taoism and Confucianism. As a sinologist, he contributed to the Chinese studies of and lexicography of Chinese language. As spiritual guide and master, drawing on spiritual resources of Christian tradition as well as Asian religions, he worked tirelessly to find the bridges of understanding between spiritualities of East and the West, especially promoting the praxis of meditation and contemplation of East and West as essential dimension of this encounter between the great religions of humanity. In this way, he helped many Christians and non-Christians as well in their spiritual process of self-realization through reaching the depths of their proper religious identity and tradition. His teaching and publications helped many Christians to understand and respect other religious traditions. So, some basic facts from his life, about his life. First of all, he became, as a young man, he entered religious order. He discovered the religious vocation. He was interested in going to the mission in Africa or Russia, but then he realized that this is not his place. He realized that he needs to go deeper into what he called spiritual deserts, not geographical deserts like Africa or Russia, where Christianity still needs to be preached, promoted, and grown. But he realized there is something more. He realized the need and the desire for spiritual nourishment of so many people in the modern era. So to answer them, he also wanted to answer by being generous in his answering the missionary call, vocation. And then he realized that he wanted to go to China. One day he said, I will be a missionary. And then when he realized that China is his goal, then China, he says it openly in his spiritual personal writings, China became more important for him than France. That was very strong statement at early stage. Then he went to, he was missioned eventually to China, to Shanghai, to teach at Aurora University. There was a former Jesuit university before communism came to power. Then was sent for PhD research at Harvard University in the States, but after 3 years, he was told by the superiors that you have to decide to come back or not come back at all, because the communists were actually gradually taking power in Shanghai, and it was the last moment for him to come back. So in '49, he came back to Shanghai, stayed there only few years, because then we know that all foreigners were forced to leave China. In 1953, he had to leave Shanghai, and then he spent several years in Taiwan first, between 53 to 59. Then he was in Vietnam between 59 and 64. And then eventually also came back to Taiwan to continue his study of religion, teaching, and promoting contemplation and meditation. So I mentioned about these spiritual deserts that were very important to him, to realize that he needs to answer not just by following the missionary vocation, but also to provide the spiritual nourishment, enhance his interest in deepening the spiritual traditions of Asia, especially Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. First of all, Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, became his focus of interest because he understood that I need to understand Buddhism in order to be able to preach properly the gospel to the Chinese. That was very clear conviction of him. Among his writings, we can mention 4 different groups of writings. I will briefly mention only the missiological writings, writings on contemplation and spirituality, which interest us here, historical, philological, lexicographical writings, and finally also writings on comparative religion and interreligious dialogue. So one of these 2 last books are, in my view, probably the deepest, the most important ones, The Depth of God in 75 and The Ways of Contemplation, East and West. There is one more book that I treasure very much, which is very personal diary, which he wrote through all these years until his death, and it was published posthumously only after his death. The title is God's Deserts. The Désert de Dieu, the French original. This is the most, probably the deepest, the most personal reflection on his spiritual struggle and realization. So these are examples of the covers of a few of his books. And now let me introduce the aspect to contemplation, which is very essential in my view, and also in the itinerary, spiritual itinerary of Father Raguin, the importance of mindfulness, attention, and awareness in the daily life. This is something that if we want to understand properly and to practice deeply contemplation or meditation, whatever you choose, it cannot be practiced in depth without our daily struggle to exercise and to master our ability to practice mindfulness, attention, and awareness of everything which is happening around us. With this mindfulness and attention it is also very important to realize that the silence and stillness is essential in terms of providing proper conditions for contemplation. Of course, people can also find a way of ability to pray in distraction, in different circumstances of life, in critical moments, in the moments of distress and even depression. But of course, optimally, it is important to find the conditions that will facilitate the prayer. That's why silence and stillness is very important. Jesus himself said that if you want to pray, you go to your room and close your door and pray to your Father, and then your Father who sees in secret will pay you back. Right? So the prayer is something that should be for show off. It is something that is in secret between us and Father. Many centuries later, a French philosopher, Blaise Pascal, said something like that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Very interesting diagnosis. Especially we can consider that, taking into consideration, realizing that this phrase has been often repeated, but in the era of smartphones and social media, it is easy to forget how striking it was when he wrote it in 17th century. Of course, not always we have the proper space for prayer. There are people whose life has been destroyed who do not have proper conditions for prayer, but still they are able to focus and to exercise and to practice the prayer. This is the example of, I guess you can imagine, this is one of the iconic moments from Syria, when the country was terribly devastated and still terribly devastated. You have this wonderful example of a man, old man, sitting quietly in a room and listening to the music. This is, to me, a wonderful example of a person of integrity who, amidst the distress and war, is able to pray, to focus, to be attentive. So solitude and silence is something that we need to also to cherish in order to help us with the prayer. According to Father Thomas Keating, who is one of the promoters José Saramago compared the situation in which we live now to Plato's cave. He says that the world is becoming a cave just like Plato's, everyone looking at images and believing they are reality. I think in the time of coronavirus and the lockdowns, we are more forced to use social media and to be exposed to this reality. But how much we are really aware of this, being in this network, or if you like, matrix of reality. This is a contemporary image of Plato's cave, painted by Ella Baron. Very interesting vision of Plato's cave in contemporary times, contemporary context. So we can ask ourselves how we are mindful in this reality of what is happening around us. Are we like, for example, those students in the museum who come to admire the art, but eventually spend most of the time focusing on their mobile phones? It's quite shocking image, to me at least. We have also another example of people who are observing, somebody, a visitor, and then you see everybody perceiving the reality through the mobile phone. But in the middle there's only one person fully concentrated and really enjoying the moment of somebody's presence. That is beautiful image of attention and contemplation in action. Here in the center, this old lady. This attention is very important because this can lead us to a deep prayer. Without attention, we cannot pray properly, in my view. And also Simone Weil, a French philosopher, said beautifully that absolutely unmixed attention is prayer. So she compares already the fact of being attentive to an act of prayer. She says that attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer. It presupposes faith and love. This is from Gravity and Grace. It's a beautiful text on contemplation. So now from this focus on daily mindfulness and attention, we move to two basic approaches to reality, especially to supernatural reality. In the tradition, in the Catholic tradition, we have these two models developed, mainly cataphatic and apophatic approach. What does it mean? The cataphatic approach is the one that approaches God or the divine by affirmations or positive statements about what God is. So it's a positive language, right? While apophatic language attempts to approach God, the divine, by negation, to speak only in terms of what may not be said about the perfect goodness that is God. So it's a negative language, what we cannot say about God. These two elements are present, be it in the West or in the East. In the East, in this context, we have more apophatic tradition which has developed. In the West, in the Western Christianity, predominantly we have cataphatic tradition. This apophatic tradition was relegated to mystics, and Yves Raguin is very aware of it when he considers these two elements, compares them. He says exactly, this is kind of tendency in the West that we have, we focus the church, the tradition, focus on cataphatic tradition instead of apophatic. So he also, in the Chinese context, he uses these two terms, two ways of knowing God and speaking about Him, the way of affirmation, 肯定, and the way of negation, 否定. From these two approaches, one can gain the knowledge of God or about God, the religious experience. Karl Rahner stated very simply but beautifully, knowing God is more important than knowing about God. I think it's a very subtle difference between this. I think we most of our time we focus on knowing about God, and we convey that knowledge about God, that conveying knowledge of God based on our personal experience. This was very important for Father Raguin when he realized that religious experience is essential in realizing how to be authentic and truthful witness of the gospel. You cannot just use books and the knowledge of the gospel understanding to share this knowledge if it does not come from the internal realization of this truth in the personal life of the people. So he recognizes, Father Yves Raguin recognizes that in Christianity, not only in Buddhism, there are non-personal experiences. Also in Christianity, we have personal and non-personal experience of God. This non-personal has been treated with suspicion because, oh, this might be some kind of pantheism or whatever, so dangerous, right? Theology does not treat with that too much. But for him it is very important that we bring together these two elements, personal and non-personal elements. Ultimately, there is a transcendence of God which we are facing as those who are approaching the divine reality. And he says that, "O God, your immensity fills the earth and the whole universe, but the universe itself cannot contain you, much less the earth, and still less the world of my thoughts." Speaking about the knowledge of God, approaching what is unknowable in God, a person has to approach it with humility and with ability to accept the emptiness and silence, entering the desert of God, because this is the language God speaks for those who want to enter into the depth of His reality. He once reflected, focusing or starting from the Buddha's experience, which influenced his reflection very much when he was reflecting about Buddha's experience, negative, apophatic experience of the Buddha. He started to ask himself how to reflect about the absolute, general. He thought that it is always beyond words. We cannot contain it, close it in human language. Then, I quote, he says, "Looking at my own beliefs as a Catholic, I became aware that I pretend to know God because I had so many books telling me about God and so many clear teachings, Buddha's attitude made me ask myself, are you that sure that you know God? My pretension to know God appeared to me childish. The fact that Christ told us about God does not mean that we can really know Him. It is a very challenging statement of Raguin, based on this his experience encounter with Buddhism, and help him to re-evaluate his knowledge of God, not about God. Personal. So, according to Yves Raguin, we should approach the mystery of the reality of God from three perspectives. He calls them the three gates to the beyond. This is very important to see systematically how he approached that reality. According to him, there are three gates to the world of mystery. And actually it corresponds very well with what St. Ignatius of Loyola wrote to Francis Borgia about this opening the minds and hearts. We must make plenty of room for good thoughts and holy inspirations, opening fully the gates of our minds and hearts. So how it works for Raguin? What are these three gates? First one is so-called the upper gate. If we want to reach God, we may go through either of the three ways. One of the three ways, the first one leads to God on high. We enter this way through a gate which is called the upper gate. Another one, so this is the way leading to God, direct way leading to God. In a sense, this is a way that is reserved for mystics and those who have a special experience. Then we have another gate which leads to God immanent in everything, in people, in nature. It is called middle gate. Okay, it's the kind of contemplating God in everything that surrounds us. It opens in every direction. It is a gate without a gate, actually. And finally, we may try to find God at the depth of our being. I entered this way through the lower gate. This is called the lower gate. It is a gate which leads to interiority. Okay, so it is introspection. It is life of interiority, of prayer, when the person enters the spiritual dimension. Now, some distinctions and issues about meditation and contemplation. These terms are basically interchangeable often, but of course they are not the same. Regarding the discursive meditation or meditation in general, we use minds, imagination, and also other faculties which are actively employed in the effort to understand our relationship with God. What regards contemplative prayer, this activity is curtailed, so that contemplation has been described as a gaze of faith or silent love. It's a prayer without words. It's contemplative gaze of faith and love. Even Pope Francis, if you follow the Wednesday messages, general audiences, last Wednesday he spoke about meditation. A beautiful text, not too long, I recommend you to read. Beautiful text about meditation. And he says in this, we all need to meditate, to reflect, to discover ourselves. It is a human dynamic. Especially in the voracious Western world, people seek meditation because it represents a higher barrier against the daily stress and emptiness that is everywhere. We are not made to run all the time. We have an inner life that cannot always be neglected. Meditating is therefore a need for everyone. Meditating, so to say, is like stopping and taking a breath in life, to stop and be still. What are the forms of contemplation? Now we can enumerate, or we can imagine what kind of form of contemplation we can practice. First of all, one of them is, for example, drumming. Practicing surrendering the mind and attuning the body through rhythm. Another one is ecstatic dance, moving freely to the rhythm of the music. Chanting, singing with intention. Centering prayer, observing and letting go of all thoughts without judgment during a period of silence. Then walking meditation, taking slow and mindful steps. And then also Lectio Divina, which is a reading short passages of text in a contemplative way. Another example is welcoming prayer, welcoming any feeling, sensation, or emotion that arises in the midst of your day. Yahweh prayer, consciously saying God's name through each breath. It's a beautiful prayer, actually. Pranayama, breathing mindfully, counting your breaths, being aware of your breathing, pranayama. And also loving kindness meditation is to recognize your inner source of loving kindness and sending love also to other people. Father Yves Raguin's view of contemplation can be summarized in these four aspects, which I found, which I drew from his writings as very important. First of all, contemplation, as I said before, it is preparatory note to contemplation, attention, pure attention. It's very important to understand contemplation from this perspective. Then it is also interior dialogue with self. Contemplation for Yves Raguin is sort of meditation without an object. This concept he took from Buddhist Zen, where Buddhist meditation without an object is very important. But meditation without an object actually is not a meditation, because meditation in itself should have its object. Whatever it is, a word of God, a notion, an image, whatever content, an object. But meditation without an object eventually is to getting rid of any objects and to sit purely in total silence and letting God reveal himself from the depth of heart of every person. And also he compares or names contemplation as the highest contemplation is an act of pure virginity. Why it is act of pure virginity? Because in myself I'm alone with God. The very close, intimate relationship with Father. So he also mentions about two roads to the experience of absolute. Before I mentioned about three gates to the mystery, now we have two roads to the experience of the absolute. And very simple one is the practice of faith and devotion. And also the next one is Zen ecstasy. Not ecstasy, Zen ecstasy. Here, this ecstasy means endless descent into the depths of myself until absolute awakes in my being. This is the inspiration from Zen he took for his personal prayer. He also treasures very much so-called mantric prayer or the Jesus prayer, which is popular in Eastern Christian churches. it consists simply in repeating the name of Jesus while being mindful in faith and love of his presence within the heart. Such a prayer creates in the body and mind a sensation of serenity and induces a state of such deep peace that awareness of Christ's loving presence within is intensified. He also speaks about so-called ejaculatory prayers. I don't know whether you heard this term. It's quite a new, not typical, not commonly used. It means they are also called eros prayers, a powerful way to cry out to God in desperation. Short prayers directed toward God in situation of crisis. They are heartfelt cries to God, inspired by love, hope, and recognition of need. They arise from the depths of the soul and move outward to God beyond. Finally, he also speaks about two general forms of contemplation, which are called the outside and the inside, which in a sense corresponds to what I said before about the gates. The outside, of course, is to contemplate God, mystery in the surrounding, in other people, in the nature. But then eventually it goes back to myself, to the internal life, and to contemplate God within me. Such a insight meditation, contemplation, helps me to reach interiority, that there is no more exteriority, where the inside and the outside coincide in a mutual co-inclusion. So in this experience of insight contemplation, I do not dualistically divide the reality between inside and outside, but one reality the reality inside and outside become one in this religious experience. So, as I mentioned that his practice of contemplation and reflection, theological reflection, was deeply inspired by Chinese thought, especially Buddhism. So we may try to ask ourselves, what was the impact of Zen on the Christian form of prayer, in his case, of course. According to him, he borrowed, as I mentioned before, he named his experience not as a Christian Zen, as some Christians used to call their own experience. They call themselves, they are practicing Christian Zen. Actually, he thought that this is not the proper way of calling it. He says, no, my experience is a Christian experience, but in the form of Zen. Okay? So it is not mixing up the content and the importance. It's still Christian prayer, but it is in the form of Zen. So he uses Zen practice as a tool, as a way of helping him in the Christian prayer. The proof for it is that his practice of prayer was always Christocentric. Okay, it was not some kind of pantheistic, whatever application. No, always Christ was at the center of every prayer. And as I said before, contemplation was an act of pure virginity, because God is at the center of this prayer, in my innermost self. The method of prayer was important for him, but only should be considered as a method, not more. It is expedient mean. It is a mean for a deeper realization of relationship with God. He calls prayer, compares the prayer to love, or the experience of love. He says that the prayer should be learned, as love should be practiced and learned. It's a process of learning. His contemplation was aimed at searching the depth of man and the depth of God. These two dimensions also cannot be separated. One cannot reach the depth of God without reaching the depth of man, and the other way around. To understand himself better, deeply, one has to enter into the depth dimension of God. Hence, we have the importance of this book, The Depth of God, penetrating his present in many of his thoughts. So now the contribution to Christian spirituality. First of all, he says that the practice and method of concentration and attention helped him to better comprehend the Christian spirituality. It helped me to rediscover some aspects of the Christian spirituality which has been a little bit forgotten in the course of last centuries. He says that the last few centuries, the Occidental spirituality took the direction of exteriority, pretending to remain spiritual. Pretending to remain spiritual. Very strong statement. Orient kept alive this interiorizing tradition that is preserved in Zen. This is a direct quote from Raguin. It's not my elaboration of this. So he really deeply appreciated the contribution of Zen. Finally, from his experience of prayer, he had also several moments of transformation, if you like, conversion in his life, deep realization. One of them was in Japan when he went to Kyoto. I will not speak enough about this, too much about this because we don't have time, but I will simply mention that his encounter with Buddhist masters, teachers, and with Zen practice had deep impact on him. And actually, few days later, he was traveling in 75 from Japan, flying to Vancouver in Canada, 3 days after meeting with this Zen master, and he got realization on the plane. So don't limit the possibility of getting enlightened just to the way of sitting on navel-gazing experience. It may happen in every circumstances in your life. It happened on the plane, and it happened when he was in the bed in France at Rue Blanc during his retreats. That was the second important moment in his life. When he was still in bed, he experienced a deep transformation when he realized that God is penetrating the whole reality, including himself, revealing his love. So these two moments were very profound in his life. Okay, and then I will finish with the third part of, briefly speaking about the third part of my presentation, which is the relationship between contemplation and leadership. Father Stephan will say a few more words about this. In my view, it is important not to forget about this link. Sometimes there is a lot of misunderstanding and confusion about these two notions, how to connect them and why we connect them. The spiritual life, there is in our, as we believe strongly, there is a connection between contemplative life, spiritual transformation, and moral leadership. They also cannot be separated, or we are fake leaders and realization of the plenitude. At one point, everybody who wants to be transformed in his life needs to give up what he has or acquired until the radical spiritual death to her undiluted self, which is understood as the part of a person which clings to things or views that enslave the self and deprive it of real freedom from illusion. The true leader is the one who went through the process of self-abnegation, who knows very well his inner self, strengths and weaknesses. In a word, he is the person who becomes first a leader for himself. Only then he can accompany and lead others on their personal existential paths. There is a connection between the leadership and wisdom. The true wisdom cannot be, the true leadership cannot be associated with power, cannot be confused with power, because the wise people, they do not need power in order to lead. In order to lead, one has to know himself and to lead himself. There is this interconnection between these two dimensions. They cannot be separated. Okay, and I conclude with a final statement, which is quite shocking, but might be shocking to some. Hopefully not. It was one of the strongest statements I found in Raguin, talking about the way he was transformed through the encounter with Chinese religions, especially Buddhism, and how this reoriented his missionary approach to the reality of being sent to preach the gospel. He says, he speaks about the so-called sequela Christi, or imitatio Christi, or following Christ. What does it mean for him? We normally think, right, we need to follow Christ, to imitate him in what he did, and so on. But what does it mean in the context here and now? Here we have the quote. He says, the ultimate stage of the gospel is not to listen to Christ, not to follow him, not to imitate him. Shocking, right? Not to face him, but to let him reveal himself at the depth of our being. Living in us, he teaches us how to face his Father in silence of thoughts. This is the last stage of the teaching of Christ. Unbelievable. I find this statement very shocking, in a sense, for our, so to speak, conventional understanding of what does it mean in our Western Christianity to follow Christ. So he concludes that this is another example of what I mean when I said that the study of Buddhism helped me to deepen my understanding of my own faith. So this is, briefly speaking, Father Yves Raguin in a nutshell. I have to omit many other dimensions, but I think it gave you some sense, at least some sense of what kind of personality he was and what kind of realization he experienced in his life. And this really challenged his traditional belief and understanding of things, but also helped him to gain so many friends in this part of the world. And I think this is a model also for us, as we believe, as I deeply believe, the model for us to implement also this kind of attitude in the future, because I think it brought a lot of fruits in his life, and it will continue to bring fruits in the coming future. Thank you very much.